Well, here we are at the end of this wonderful study, and I'll tell you, I feel very privileged to get to share this last lesson with you as we have been seeing these salvation stories from the Old Testament. And I wish that I had had this study when I was a new believer, because it's really helpful, isn't it, to see how the story of salvation. In fact, there's this Presbyterian pastor by the name of Stephen Nicoletti, and he writes and talks about that, and he says, this is the big story of the Bible. And it stretches across the entire Bible from the beginning to the end. But it is also a story that the Bible plays out in miniature over and over again throughout the pages of Scripture. And I love that idea that we have looked at these little miniature stories of salvation 7 times during this study. And we've seen these mini stories in the lives of real failed human beings. And the Lord has still taught us through them. So we started remembering what Allison told us the very first night, Genesis 3:15, when God said to Satan, after the fall, I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. That was the promise of salvation, that the enemy was going to be crushed, and it would come through the woman, through the seed, and that's what would eventually crush the serpent's head. And then we saw through Noah's story that salvation is needed. We live in a fallen world, as did Noah. And then through Abraham and Isaac's story, remember that one? That salvation is substitutionary, that God will provide the sacrifice necessary for the payment of sin. And next we learned from Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness that salvation is life, living water. And then on to Numbers, the serpent on the pole. I think that might be my favorite one because I learned so much from that, and that salvation is gracious. And then in Joshua chapter 5, through Rahab's story, we learned that salvation is for all people, even us. And then last week, we wound up in 1 Samuel 17, where David destroyed the giant Goliath by the power of God and showed us that salvation is won by another. We're not David. We're Israel, and we needed a champion in that story. And so today's story brings us to this joyful conclusion, an invitation to a feast. And David's in it, too, just like he was last week. And so as a matter of reference, I just want to briefly skim over his life to this point. We first meet him in 1 Samuel, around chapter 15, and we know that God had rejected Saul, Israel's first king, because of his disobedience and his infidelity to God. And isn't that always the way it is? Lack of faith, infidelity, and disobedience always get us in trouble. And God had told Samuel the prophet then that he had removed his spirit from that first king and to anoint a shepherd boy, a young guy, David, to be the next king. But it doesn't happen immediately. It's not like, boom, and now we have king number 2. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, 17, 18, 19, that's where we read about how David had begun serving Saul occasionally, playing soothing music to him when he was being tormented by an evil spirit, fighting battles, even going out and slaying Goliath, as we saw last week. And meanwhile, Saul knows that anointing has been removed, and he is feeling more and more threatened by David, because David is going out and fighting and winning more and more battles for Saul. He's jealous. And that jealousy and that anger are provoked every time David wins one of those battles for him. So he begins stalking David, tracking him, trying to kill him, do away with the threat. Meanwhile, David and Saul's son Jonathan have become best friends. And Jonathan protects David in remarkable ways. Don't you think Jonathan was an amazing human being as you read these stories? He helps him escape from his father when his father is trying to kill him. They swear allegiance to one another. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 32, we read that Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" That was Jonathan. That was the king's son, who was probably raised and groomed to be the next king of Israel. He was the next in line to become the king himself, but he goes ahead and promises lifelong allegiance to David. And David was his father Saul's perceived threat. I think that's an amazing thing to ponder. Anyway, David continues hiding from Saul, and Saul becomes progressively agitated and violent. And by the end of 1 Samuel, both Saul and Jonathan have been killed in battle with the Philistines. And so 2 Samuel starts with a period of mourning that David requires for Saul and for Jonathan, and then this prolonged war between the house of David and the house of Saul, until finally David is established as the undisputed king of Israel. And that's where this story begins today. And I'm going to read the chapter. If you have an NIV, that's where I'll be reading from, so if you want to follow along with me. If you have a different version, you're welcome to follow along, but I, for one, get really confused when the words don't match up exactly, so if you want to just, close your eyes, listen, whatever, let's just put ourselves into the story and then we'll talk. 2 Samuel 9. And David said, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?" And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lodabar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" And then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. So let's stop a minute and think about this guy, Mephibosheth. 5 chapters earlier, 2 Samuel chapter 4, we learned that all of Saul's legitimate sons and possible heirs to the throne of Israel were dead by that time. And that Saul's son Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth who was crippled as a child. He was 5 years old when the report came from Jezreel that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle. When the child's nurse heard the news, she picked him up and fled. But as she hurried away, she dropped him, and he became crippled. So Mephibosheth was 5 years old at the time of his grandfather Saul's death and his father Jonathan. Maybe he was around 13, something like that, when David finally ascended to the throne. Remember, after that prolonged time of war between the two houses. And maybe around the 7th or 8th year early on in David's reign over all of Israel, Mephibosheth would have been 20 or 21 years old. So imagine this young man. This is a young man at this time. He's a young man with a disability, crippled in both feet. He's a young man with a disability, and he's hiding from David, the new king of Israel. Mephibosheth was no doubt aware of the fact of what new kings did back in the day. Newly established kings often just took out all rivals, including their own siblings and members of their own family, to be sure that they didn't have any rivals to their seat on the throne. So I just think, whoa, Mephibosheth must have been really scared. Really scared when he heard that King David was looking for him. He had sent word out, let me know if there's anybody left of Saul's family. And the place where he was hiding out is an interesting thing too. Lo Debar. Debar means word or thing. And lo is the prefix to that, and it's a negator, so it means not a word or not a thing, nothing, for instance. It's not a real positive name for a town. No town or nothing town. One commentator said, the grandson of Israel's first king had lost everything and was living in no man's land. And then there was that matter of his disability. He was crippled in both feet. So disability in ancient times was attributed to God. The general view, we know this is not true, but the general view then was that God brought disability as a punishment for sin or as an expression of his wrath because of a person's direct disobedience to him. So it wasn't a good thing in those days to be disabled. Mephibosheth was disabled. He was alone. He was afraid. He was hiding out in no man's land. He couldn't even approach the king on his own power. Somebody was going to have to bring him. Can you relate to Mephibosheth? I know if this story is supposed to be a miniature salvation story, boy, I see myself in Mephibosheth. Hiding from God, weak, poor, lame, fearful, before the king comes and gets me and gets you. One writer describes the circumstances like this, that we're separated from our king because of our wicked ancestors. We have all inherited a sin nature. And we're separated from our king because of our deliberate actions. I mean, I don't know if you can think of it specifically, but I can. Hiding from God because of my sin, not wanting to really be upfront with him. We've separated ourselves from our king because we don't know him, and we don't understand his love for us. Mephibosheth expected the worst from David. He didn't know that David's intent for him was good. And likewise, we can fear God because we don't know him. And when we do know him, that's when we have a relationship with him, is when we come to trust him. And then we trust him even with our weaknesses and our disabilities. We know, too, that our king sought us before we sought him. That's the truth for every one of us. David went after Mephibosheth. It wasn't the other way around. Mephibosheth didn't try to get word to the new king, hey, here I am. No. And God is the one who seeks us, right? Romans 3:11, there is no one who seeks after God. 1 John 4:19, we love him because he first loved us. I got another page. I have 2 more scriptures. Here they are, John 6:44. No one, this is Jesus talking, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And John 6:65, no one can come to me, Jesus said, unless it has been granted to him by my Father. Also, we know that the king's kindness in this story and the king's kindness to us is based on a covenant. David remembered his covenant with his best friend, and so he searched for Mephibosheth to bless him. And God seeks and offers to us ultimate good through Jesus because he promised. Jesus Christ kept the promise when he died for us on the cross. Another example from this story is that we must receive the king's kindness in humility. Mephibosheth bowed in humility before King David, not expecting anything good, maybe hoping that he wouldn't get killed. Had he continued hiding, or had he tried to muscle his way in before David, hey, I am Saul's grandson. Really, I am really more legitimate here than you. If he tried to do anything like that, he would have failed. It's the same thing with us. We have to recognize who God is and who we are before him. And only in humility are we capable of receiving his blessings. And there are so many more examples through this story, I think, of how we are Mephibosheth. But possibly the best example to me comes in verse 7. Don't be afraid, David said to Mephibosheth. I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table. There it is. And you will eat here with me at the king's table. The king returns to us more than we lost when we were hiding from him. Mephibosheth got all his grandfather's land. We have the privilege of provision at the king's table, a feast. We are received like sons of the king. And we get access to him, to the king himself, and we get to have fellowship with the whole family, all of his kids seated at the table. I just love that so much. And that's where our mini salvation story is going to end today, but here's the last verse in that chapter. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now, he was lame in both his feet. Mephibosheth had it made, undeserved, unexpected, unrequested kindness from the king, a seat at the table, an invitation to feast as one of the king's own children, and yet that final note. Now, he was lame in both his feet. And I pondered that for a long time. Why would we end it like that? Every word of Scripture is important. And why end the story with the lame thing? Well, this is what I think. I don't know if this is exactly why it's in there, but this is what the Lord spoke to me. They remind me that the king's favor does not immediately take away our weaknesses or our lameness. It gives us favor and it gives us standing that can overcome our human frailties and can even change the way we see ourselves. Or not. There's a caution there. I think it's a warning. And I want to show you what I mean by just telling you a little make-believe story. It's not true. It's a once upon a time story, but maybe see if you can relate this way. Once upon a time, there lived a good and gracious king, and he loved all the subjects of his land. And one day, the king decided that he was going to give a great feast and a grand ball for all of his subjects just to show them how much he loved them. So he sent couriers all throughout the land, a bustling big cities, medium-sized towns, tiny villages, even to the farthest outposts at the borders of the country, inviting everyone, men, women, young, old, rich, poor, all to come to the palace at such and such a time on such and such a day for a great feast and a grand ball. And it was very exciting. I mean, people began preparing for this great feast and grand ball. And if you'd seen in the windows of houses late at night, there'd be candles burning where mothers and daughters were sewing fine fabrics to make new gowns to wear. And the fathers and sons would be out in the fields far after sunset practicing courtly manners to get ready for when they went to the great feast and the grand ball. Finally, the day arrived. Now, if you'd been there early in the morning, you would have seen something quite extraordinary. It was a misty morning, very dark. The sun hadn't even peeped over the top of the mountains yet. But there, high up on the hill where the king's palace stood, there stood a lone figure at the palace gates, kind of hunched over and trembling. And you saw a hand shaking, reaching up and tapping on the gate. And soon a guard came, and this figure didn't even dare to raise his head. When the guard asked what he was doing there, he said, "I have a message for the king." Well, the guard turned and went, left this poor figure standing there, hunched over, and I know who he was. He was a beggar, dressed in filthy, dirty rags. He actually lived down in the little village at the very bottom of the hill upon which the king's palace sat. And that beggar had lived there all his life. He had never had an education. He didn't have a job, wasn't trained to do anything except for beg, which he did. And the villagers would, give him a few coins occasionally. And he usually slept out in the fields, but if it rained, a kind farmer would let him sleep in their barn. And that's how he lived his life. What was he doing at the king's palace? Well, soon, we're going to find out because we heard footsteps coming and a jolly voice saying, "My friend, I understand you need to speak with me." It was the king himself. And the poor beggar said, "Oh, your majesty, I'm so sorry. I just have to tell you that I will not be coming to the great feast today." "Well, why ever not, my friend?" said the king. And the poor beggar said, "Oh, your majesty, please forgive me, but I have nothing to wear in your presence but these filthy rags. I wouldn't dishonor you by coming into your presence dressed like this. Please forgive me." And then the strangest thing happened. The king started to laugh, and he grabbed the beggar by the arm, and he said, "Well, come with me, my friend." And he took him right into the palace, up a bunch of stairs, down a bunch of halls, into his own bedchamber, where he threw open his wardrobe doors, and he said, "My friend, you have nothing to wear? Well, let me supply you with something. You may choose any of these robes you want. Put it on, and then come downstairs and meet me because the guests are soon to arrive." And he left him. And he was standing there in his filthy rags looking at these beautiful garments of the king's. He stood there for a long time, but he finally inched over and started touching the satins and the brocades and the silks. At last he chose a robe, and he slipped it on. It was emerald green velvet, so thick you could lose your fingers in it, with a gold brocade down the front and around the neck, and a bright ruby jewel at the neck. He dropped his filthy rags to the ground and stepped up and looked at himself in the mirror. And, oh my, he thought to himself, I look taller. I look handsome. I look wise. He couldn't believe himself dressed in this beautiful garment of the king's. And he spun on his heel, was about to leave the room when he turned and looked back because there on the floor was this pile of rags. What to do with them? The robe had no pockets. He needed to get those rags out of there. He wasn't going to dishonor the king by leaving him in his room. So he picked up those rags. They had a stench. This is the only thing he'd ever had to wear. But they did smell bad, and yet that smell was familiar to him. He knew that smell. He thought, well, maybe I'll just wad them up in the tiniest ball I can, put them under my arm, and when I leave the great feast, I will take them and dispose of them in the village. So that's what he did. Went down, joined the king. There were all the people seated at these great banqueting tables, and he himself was seated there. And the king stood up, offered a prayer of thanks, and everybody took their goblets for a toast. The wine was poured, and the king stood toasting his subjects, and they all raised their glasses to toast, but the beggar didn't really get to do that because he didn't want to dislodge the pile of rags, but no matter. He missed the toasting, but then they brought in the food. I mean, liveried servants bringing great platters of food, all kinds of food that you could imagine. Meats, roasts, pheasant, beef, pork chops, breads, fruits, anything you could imagine, and more. And each person, as the platter came by, was to pick up their plate and serve themselves. But the poor beggar, he had such trouble trying to pick his plate up at the same time, serve himself, and he got a few morsels, but really he didn't get much of that banquet at all. And when it was over, the king invited everyone to come into the grand ballroom for the dancing. And he walked up to the beggar and he said, "My friend, you're my special guest. I would like for you to look over the young ladies of the kingdom and invite anyone that you'd like to begin the dancing. Will you do that?" He blushed bright red, but said, "Oh, yes, Your Majesty, I'd be happy to." So all the people walked into that beautiful ballroom with parquet floors and glistening crystal chandeliers and orchestra tuning up at the far end of the room. And they stood around as the beggar walked and looked at all the young ladies in the kingdom. And the girls, if you could have heard, they were pinching their cheeks and fluffing their hair. "Oh, I hope he asks me. He looks so kind. He's tall and handsome, too. I wonder who he is. Vaguely familiar. I don't know who he is, but oh, I hope he asks me to dance." And finally, he did. He saw a nice young girl with beautiful brown curls and brown eyes. She had a kind smile, and he said, "Would you do me the honor?" "Yes," she said. So he gave her his hand, and they walked to the middle of the floor. And the music began to play, and he bowed to her, and she curtsied to him. He held out his hand to her, and they began to dance. And then there was silence in the room. What was that? What was that smelly thing in the middle of the floor? What was that? And people began to look around, and whispers began to start. What has he got? What has he brought into the king's palace? That is disrespectful and smelly too. Wait, I know who that man is. That's the beggar who lives down in that little village, down at the bottom of the hill. Those are his filthy rags, and he brought them into the king's presence. I can't believe that. He doesn't look that tall or wise or kind or even handsome. And the poor beggar was just so flustered, so embarrassed and humiliated. He reached down, he grabbed those rags, and he ran out the door, all the way down the hill to his village, and that's where he slept that night, and it rained. Well, years went by, and the beggar never left the village. He stayed there all of his life, never getting a job, never getting an education, never doing anything good for anybody else. But he kept that robe that the king had given him, and then he died. And when he died, the kind villagers put a simple casket in the chapel and had a little service for him. And they laid him out there in that beautiful velvet emerald green robe, so thick you could lose your fingers in it, with the gold brocade and the ruby jewel. There he was, laid out in his casket. And wadded up next to him was his pile of filthy rags. And the king himself came to pay his respects. And as he looked down at that beggar in the coffin, he said with sadness and love, "My friend, I gave you the best I had. And you never fully got to enjoy it because you wouldn't release those filthy rags." And that's what Mephibosheth's story at the end reminds me. Not to let our past failures, our lameness, our weaknesses define who we are. We've been invited to a feast, you guys. And we want to enjoy every single bit of it, but not holding on to things from our past, maybe feelings of guilt or habits that we have that are unpleasing to the Lord, or unforgiveness. Those kinds of things are the filthy rags, I think. And Hebrews 12:1 says that we need to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with endurance the race set before us. Let us run to that banqueting table and enjoy the feast that we get to have, not only now in this world, but forever. So we're going to end our study today with the feast. And it celebrates what our Lord Jesus did for us in the past, and it celebrates what we anticipate in the future, the marriage supper of the Lamb. And Pastor Steve is going to come and lead us now. Can you do that?